Crime has always been a man's world, but what about the woman who chooses to break the rules? They say that behind every great man is a great woman, but what about the notorious female criminals who stand on their own? Welcome to Real Stories Documentary. In this video, we'll take a walk on the wild side and explore the top 10 most notorious female criminals in the world. These women have committed unthinkable acts, from murder to drug trafficking and everything in between. Their stories are raw, gritty, and sometimes downright shocking, but they're also a fascinating glimpse into the darker side of human nature. So get ready to feel your heart race as we delve into the world of criminal women and the impact they've had on society. This isn't your typical list of lawbreakers. It's a roller coaster ride of danger, intrigue, and unexpected twists. Are you ready to join us? Number 1. Bonnie Parker. Bonnie Parker was born in 1910 in Texas and grew up in poverty during the Great Depression. In 1930, she met Clyde Barrow, and the two began a life of crime together. While Bonnie was often depicted in popular culture as a gun-toting, cigar-smoking femme fatale, in reality, she was a small woman who mostly served as a lookout and driver during their crimes. The Barrow gang committed numerous robberies, murders, and other crimes throughout the early 1930s, often targeting banks and police officers. Bonnie and Clyde's crime spree made them both notorious figures, with law enforcement agencies across multiple states working to bring them to justice. However, Bonnie's ultimate downfall came in 1934, when she and Clyde were ambushed and killed by law enforcement officers in Louisiana. Number 2. Aileen Warnos. Aileen Warnos was a woman whose life was marked by abuse, addiction, and violence. Born in 1956 in Michigan, she had a troubled childhood that included allegations of physical and sexual abuse. She turned to prostitution at a young age, and by her late 20s had become a serial killer. Over the course of 1989 and 1990, Warnos murdered at least 7 men, most of whom she had met while working as a prostitute. But Warnos' story is not just one of brutality and violence. Her case was highly controversial, with many arguing that she had been a victim of abuse and was not in a sound mental state when she committed the murders. Some even believe that Warnos was a product of her environment, forced into a life of crime by circumstances beyond her control. Others see her as a cold-blooded killer who deserved the punishment she received. Number 3. Griselda Blanco. Blanco was responsible for smuggling thousands of pounds of cocaine into the United States in the 1970s and 1980s, making her one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the world. Her notorious reputation was due in part to her brutal tactics. She was known for ordering the killings of anyone who crossed her, including law enforcement officials and innocent bystanders. Her ruthlessness earned her a place on the FBI's most wanted list in the 1980s, and she was eventually captured and extradited to the United States, where she faced drug trafficking charges. Blanco's trial was one of the most highly publicized of the 1990s, and her conviction resulted in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, she remained a powerful figure in the criminal underworld, continuing to issue orders and maintain control over her drug empire. Number 4. Rosemary West. Rosemary West is one of the most infamous female serial killers in British history. Born in Devon, England, in 1953, she grew up in a troubled household with allegations of abuse and neglect. West's criminal activities began in her teens, when she became involved in prostitution and petty theft. In 1972, she married Fred West, who would later become her accomplice in a series of brutal murders. The couple's crimes came to light in 1994, when police discovered the remains of 12 victims buried beneath the West's home. The victims, many of whom were young women and girls, had been sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered. The discovery of the bodies sparked a media frenzy and led to one of the most high-profile murder trials in British history. West was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life in prison, while her husband took his own life while in custody. Number 5. Sylvia Likens. Sylvia Likens was a young girl from Indiana who was subjected to unspeakable torture and abuse in one of the most notorious cases of child abuse in American history. In 1965, Likens and her sister were left in the care of Gertrude Baniszewski, a woman they knew from their neighborhood. Baniszewski and several others, including some of her children and neighborhood kids, subjected Likens to weeks of physical and psychological torture that ultimately led to her death. Likens' injuries were extensive and horrific, and her death shocked the nation. Baniszewski and several others were charged with murder, and the trial was one of the most highly publicized of the era. The case also led to significant changes in Indiana's child protection laws. Number 6. Myra Hindley. Myra Hindley was a British woman who, along with her partner Ian Brady, committed some of the most shocking and brutal murders in British history. Between 1963 and 1965, the pair abducted, tortured, and killed 5 children, burying their bodies on the bleak moorlands near Manchester. Hindley's role in the killings was the subject of much debate, with some arguing that she was a willing participant in the crimes, while others saw her as a victim of Brady's manipulation and control. Nevertheless, Hindley was found guilty of the murders and sentenced to life in prison. Number 7. Dorothea Puente. Dorothea Puente was an American woman who ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California in the 1980s. But behind the facade of her seemingly innocuous business, Puente was carrying out a series of murders that shocked the nation. Puente's victims were elderly and vulnerable, many of whom were living alone and had nowhere else to turn. She lured them into her boarding house with promises of companionship and care, but instead, she drugged them, robbed them, and ultimately murdered them. In 1988, police discovered the remains of 7 people buried in the yard of Puente's boarding house. She was charged with 9 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Number 8. Karla Homolka. A Canadian woman who, along with her partner, Paul Bernardo, committed a series of heinous crimes in the early 1990s that shocked the nation. The pair were known as the Ken and Barbie killers due to their good looks and seemingly normal demeanor, which belied their violent and depraved nature. Homolka and Bernardo's victims were young women, many of whom they abducted from the streets of Toronto. They would then rape, torture, and murder them, often filming the horrific acts for their own twisted pleasure. Nevertheless, she struck a controversial plea deal in which she testified against Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to just 12 years in prison for her role in the killings, a decision that sparked outrage and controversy across Canada. Number 9. Elizabeth Báthory. Elizabeth Báthory, also known as the Blood Countess, was a Hungarian noblewoman who lived during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. She's infamous for her alleged reign of terror, during which she's said to have tortured and killed hundreds of young girls. Báthory was born into a wealthy and influential family and married into another powerful noble family at a young age. However, she's said to have become increasingly cruel and sadistic over the years, using her position of power to abuse and kill young girls from the surrounding villages. Her crimes were uncovered in 1609 when a Lutheran minister reported to the authorities that he had witnessed Báthory torturing and killing a servant girl. A trial was held, and although Báthory was not present for the proceedings, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in solitary confinement. The exact number of Báthory's victims is unclear, with some estimates ranging as high as 650. Number 10. Diane Downs. It's a chilling thought, a mother killing her own children. But for Diane Downs, that's exactly what happened in 1983. What makes this case particularly intriguing is not just the cold-blooded nature of the crime, but also the motives behind it. Downs was driven by an obsession with a married man, and she believed that her own children were standing in the way of her happiness. On May 19, 1983, Downs drove her 3 children to a remote location and shot each of them in turn. She then shot herself in an attempt to cover up the crime and claimed that she too had been a victim. Despite her efforts to deceive the authorities, Downs was eventually caught and brought to trial. She was found guilty of murder and attempted murder and was sentenced to life in prison. So, the world is full of criminals, and these women are some of the most notorious. From the Blood Countess Elizabeth Báthory to the calculated killer Diane Downs, their crimes have shocked and horrified us. While some may find fascination in their dark deeds, let us not forget the innocent lives lost at their hands.